Hi, welcome back. My name's Joel Duff from thenaturalhistorian.com and this YouTube channel. Today, I want to talk about bad apologetics. In particular, I want to look at a particular creationist ministry called Genesis Apologetics and look at a recent video of theirs and talk about how they're confused about the terms adaptation and natural selection. So Genesis Apologetics, it's not a ministry that I talk about very much on this channel because I'm usually focused on Answers in Genesis, Institute for Creation Research, maybe Creation Ministries International, and there's a few other peripheral ministries. But Genesis Apologetics, as you can see here, has 113,000 subscribers on YouTube. They have somewhat of a web presence at their other website, Genesis Apologetics. It's a creation science ministry based out of California. I would consider them mostly reusers of the primary creation ministries. And what I mean by that is they do produce some of their own stuff. I mean, they have their own videos, but nonetheless, those videos are usually using content from Answers in Genesis, Institutes for Creation Research. And in this video, they're going to use a very interesting, the author of this particular video uses a very interesting mix of information from Institutes for Creation Research and Answers in Genesis, which if you've listened to any of my other YouTube videos or read any of my blog posts, you'll recognize that those two creationist organizations disagree in terms of the mechanisms of evolution or the mechanisms of how genetic diversity has been brought about since, in their case, since Noah's flood. And nonetheless, this author seems to be unaware of how those two disagree about the mechanisms and attempts to employ both of the mechanisms at the same time without realizing that I'm not going to say they're 100% contrary to one another, but they're nonetheless not quite fully compatible, as this author might think. So what the video I'm especially interested in is this one right here from just 2 weeks ago from their student zone, meaning it's a student presentation. It's supposed to be for students in I think fifth through eighth grade, sort of level talk. And so yes, I'm not expecting him to go into any great detail. But not going into detail doesn't mean that you can be inaccurate in your statements. When you simplify very complex topics, that's a real challenge, right? I have that challenge with college level students. But simplifying down very complex topics to, say, the eighth grade level is even a greater challenge from an instructional standpoint. It's the challenge is to still present an accurate picture of the mechanisms or the meanings of the terms that you're using. And that's one of the primary problems that Dan Biddle is going to have is that. Now, before I get started, I want to acknowledge the fact that just less than an hour before I was ready to record this video, I stumbled upon the fact that Aaron Ra, a well-known atheist commentator, defender, apologist, who often likes to critique, or should I say, make fun of creation scientists on YouTube, has made an extended video covering many of the aspects of this Genesis Apologetics video that I'm going to talk about right now. My approach to critiquing creation science is very different than Aaron Ra's, and I will touch upon a number of different topics that he doesn't touch upon in his particular presentation. I am not going to show Dan Biddle's presentation. I'm actually just taking a few screenshots of, I think, the pertinent slides that allow me to talk about I think, the misconceptions that Dan Biddle has. I prefer not to say that he's lying about his topic. I just think that he is misinformed, and most of his misinformation comes from Answers in Genesis and Institutes for Creation Research and the slides that he's relying upon. Now, I just said one of the hard things to do is to take complicated topics, complicated concepts, and simplify them for an audience that doesn't understand those particular topics. Well, Answers in Genesis and Institute for Creation Research, they're also taking complex topics and essentially they're simplifying for people like Dan Biddle to try to understand. And they take that information, which has already been simplified and not packaged in the best way. I'll just put it that way. But he's going to use their information and then apply his own misconceptions and simplify it even more. And so the information tends to get worse and worse and worse as it percolates down through these various filters of creation science organizations. Which is why it's so important for an organization like Answers in Genesis or Institute for Creation Research to be more accurate, and I'll say as Christian organizations to be more cognizant of accurately representing their opponent's views in terms and definitions of terms, because so many others in the creation science community rely on their information and just have an implicit trust that what they're being told is true. They go and use their slides, they use their pieces of their presentations and incorporate it into their own, which is exactly what Dan Biddle is going to do. Is he's going to incorporate the information that he's been learning from other creation scientists and package it in a yet another format that I think compounds the problems. The other thing I'll note is this is just part one of what he's calling understanding the basics about evolutionary theory. And I'm going to be critiquing his, in a few minutes here, a few slides in which he discusses natural selection and adaptation, which are actually what he's going to discuss in part two. I can't imagine that he's going to say anything terribly different. He's just going to give some more examples of what he's already talked about in this particular talk. And I don't think he's going to have a better understanding in part two. So that's why I'm not waiting for part two, although it's been a couple weeks and it's not out yet. So I didn't think it was worth waiting to see what he has to say on the second part. All right, so let's kick it off with a couple screenshots from this YouTube video. And again, like I said, this is part one, understanding the basics, how to refute evolution. And what he's doing, he's trying to tell a fifth to an eighth grader, here's what evolutionary biology is, and here's what's wrong with it, and here's how you can easily explain to maybe your teacher in the future why what they're presenting is incorrect. So this is Dave Bisbee that we're seeing in these slides. And he begins with, hey, first of all, you need to define your terms. I agree, you need to define your terms. And this is where it begins to go awry right from the very get-go, because what are the meanings of the word evolution? Well, he's right that people do use the word evolution for adaptation, not so much genetic variation, but natural selection is also often in the public's mind synonymous with the word evolution. But then he kind of fixates on Darwinian evolution as if this were a separate category, not including the other things. And then how does he define Darwinian evolution? Life arising from non-living chemicals, which is abiogenesis, which is yet another theory which isn't Darwinian evolution at all. And so right away, he's kind of like putting Darwinian evolution, which is the type of evolution that his audience will think is like that evil, bad kind of evolution that you can't believe in, right? But you can accept these other things: adaptation, genetic variation, natural selection. Now you notice the word mutation is missing from this list, and he's going to talk about mutations later, and I will as well. And so, yes, these other things may be okay, but they're not actually evolution because it's not Darwinian evolution. Darwinian evolution is life arising from non-living chemicals. But Darwin is the one that defined or described the concept or the mechanism of how organisms adapt and change in their environments and form new species over time through the process that he called natural selection, which we now know is just one mechanism of causing organisms to adapt and change in their environments over time. So let's get right to the word adaptation. And I've skipped over a number of slides. I'm not going through his whole talk. I've just picked out a couple, I think, interesting points of reference that I think he especially misses and are maybe the most instructive. So he talks about how living creatures have the ability to detect their environment and then switch on mechanisms to help them adapt to that environment. And this is what he's going to call adaptation. Now, all that sounds, that all sounds very tempting. But what exactly is adaptation? Let's go to this next slide because it's really the same thing, but it's showing that this wolf here has a mechanism inside that resides within every creature. Now, I'm going to ask yourself. So yeah, I respond to my environment. Animals respond to our environment, and in some sense, you can think of that as a way for that's part of our programming. But is that an adaptation? All right. And in the broadest sense, it's an adaptation. But do animals derive new adaptations in this fashion? Living creatures have the ability to detect their environment and then switch on mechanisms to help them to adapt their environment. That's from his talk. And then his slide puts it this way. God gave living things the ability to detect and respond to certain environmental conditions by switching programmed responses on and off. Now, uh, what does it mean to respond to environmental conditions? So here we have this wolf, and yes, organisms have sensory organs, right? Sense, smell, touch, taste, so forth, all right? Feel, in which we are sensing the environment around us. And based on the things that we sense, we do respond to our environment, right? If it's very, very cold, I walk outside and it's extremely cold. I do respond to that cold. And if it's extremely cold and it's going to be dangerous to me, I am going to put some more clothing on, right, to protect myself. And that's my response. Now, is that a programmed response? I mean, yes, in a sense, I won't disagree that that's not a programmed response in a way that those feelings trigger things in my brain, and all that is, somehow genetically based in the way my physical being works, and I am physically responding to that temperature change, and I am doing something. Is that an adaptation? We'll come back to that in just a minute. But in his next slide, same words here on this slide, but he's showing this fox, or I'm sorry, this wolf, as if it has some sort of. You notice it's almost like it's a machine, right? And it's a machined response, and it's sort of this almost a deistic way that he talks about this, right? That God initially programs all organisms with programs, right? Presuming the DNA, and that program then is already there. It already resides inside the creatures. I said the mechanisms for these changes already reside in the creatures. So any response that any organism has on Earth was programmed into those organisms. Now, where did that programming come? Of course, he's going to say that programming came from God's initial creation in the 7 days. And when he's done with that, all the programming's there. And then so the programming is just being played out over time and in responses to the environments. Now, this is coming from, in case you're wondering, where in creation science this is coming from. This is coming from Institutes for Creation Research. Several of their current president, Randy Galiuza, uh, uh, and several other people he has working there now seem to have all kind of come together behind his idea of programmed changes. All right. And he's an engineer by training, and he views things through that engineering lens, that everything that creatures do is a programmed response to the environment. Um, and he very much disavows natural selection, right? Natural selection, he says, is not a real force in the world. It's organisms that are responding. They're moving away from something, they're coming towards something because they like that particular environment. But all those programs are inside, and they're being tripped and triggered by the environment around them, rather than the environment selecting individuals that are better than another individual. Each individual is changing. You see, if you read this again very carefully, each organism, each individual is said to be adapting, right? And this is where where Biddle is really running afoul from the typical understanding of adaptation, and as we'll see, natural selection, because he's following the ICR path here, in which each individual can literally adapt themselves to a new environment. They're changing. They're changing themselves over time. Um, and that, if you don't know the theory of natural selection or Darwin's description of natural selection, is counter to that idea. And I'll try to explain that in a moment. But let's go a little bit further with his sort of, now he tries to show to an eighth grader what adaptation is. And so he has kind of this classic example, right? You have these foxes that live in the far north, right? So the Arctic fox. And the Arctic fox is well known for changing its coat color winter and summer. And you can see there's very much a functional reason for this, right? In the winter, it's white, so it can sneak up on its prey, and it's hidden in the environment. It's cryptic. It's a camouflage, right? And then in the summer, it sheds its coat, and then it grows a new coat that has more color to it, so it blends in with the environment that is not snow covered, and therefore still has advantages in terms of catching prey. And so he's saying that this is adaptation, right? The fox is adapting to its environment, right? It has the genetic information to respond when it gets warmer, change its coat color, and so it's responding. Now, one of the problems here is that sure, I mean this is a form of adapting to the environment, but this isn't a true genetic adaptation. This isn't truly adding a new feature to this organism. This is a feature this organism has. This individual has this feature. It's not changing anything about itself. It is just using, it is tripping something in its body that says, I'm going to make more melanin. It's kind of like I have light uh, skin, right? I go outside and the sun is shining and I stand in the sun too long. I'm going to get a sunburn, but that sunburn is going to trigger the cells in my skin to produce more melanin. And by producing more melanin, I'm going to have darker skin, which is then going to help block the UV light, which will be less damaging to me the next time I go out into the sun, right? Have I adapted to the environment? Right? In his way of thinking, yes, I've adapted, right? Now, is that adaptation something that I'm going to pass down to my kids? Well, yes, but I didn't actually develop that adaptation. That ability to adapt to environment was already in me from the beginning. That's not a novel or a new feature. That isn't the product of recombination. That is simply me responding to the environment, and all organisms do respond to their environment in these ways. Um, Adaptation would be the development of a new characteristic that allows an organism to survive an environment where its former or its ancestors didn't have that particular adaptation, right? And that, when we talk about evolutionary biology, are the types of adaptations that develop and make new species. So then he kind of goes into this, all right, well, then you got to mix this idea of adaptation and genetic variation. And this is all actually very confusing in his talk because I don't think he's really thought this out very much. But so he says he's trying to get to this idea that organisms adapting to their environment can actually become different species. And this isn't evolution in his mind, right? Evolution is just this abiogenesis or something else, or one kind becoming another kind. We'll get to that. So he says, yeah, well, look, we got this wolf-like ancestor. That wolf-like ancestor then adapts in different environments. And in different environments, different traits are expressed, right? Different things, different programs are turned on. And really, it's not, you wouldn't take a wolf and that wolf, that individual wolf doesn't become all three of these different things. You have a massive population of wolves living in lots of different environments. And in those environments, some individual wolves may have, and this is where he brings in genetic variation a little bit, but he's still talking about adaptation of that as if each individual wolf has the ability to adapt. But really, it's a population that has variation. And amongst all those variations, some variations have the genetic capacity, right, to allow particular traits. Those traits then create the differences between different dogs, right? In this case, different breeds of dogs. But that's a matter of selecting of sets of different genes, different alleles, different variants that constitute those particular shapes. So you wouldn't take. I mean, I think he would agree to this, even though he kind of it doesn't talk this way. But you wouldn't have this dog could become this particular one simply by putting it in a new environment. You wouldn't take this dog that's adapted to the cold, bring it over here, and all of a sudden, hey, it would immediately adapt. That individual wouldn't adapt, right? But he talks about the programming that each animal has, and it's all there, and it can just be tripped and turned off and on to make different kinds of animals. Um, but in the idea of population biology, you have hundreds of thousands of individuals. Some of them have variations, and then you separate the variations into different pools of variants. This is natural. I'm describing natural selection, right? Natural selection, if you took a population into the cold, some individuals would have the right variants to allow them to survive in a cold weather, where the other ones wouldn't have the right genetic variants or the right programming. And so it's not a matter of turning off and on the programming within an individual responding to that environment. They all live in that environment. Some can't respond to the environment because they don't have the genetic information to do so. Some of them have particular variations that allow them to survive in that environment. They survive and have offspring, and guess what? They give their programming to the next offspring, which allows them to survive as well. I'm just describing natural selection. Okay. Now, actually, Institute for Creation Research would object to that. That's their language of programming, programmed responses, and that's what Dan Biddle is using here. But now he begins to slip in and start talking about natural selection because he's going to say, well, then you could take this dog and then you could put it in different environments, and it would then it would turn on programming to adapt to those environments. It's not really turning on programming. Individual individual individuals that are offspring of this dog would have new genetic variation because of mixing of gene pools and of course mutations, which he doesn't mention here, but new mutations, and surely domesticated dogs have many new mutations that don't exist in this wolf-like ancestor, and give them new characteristics, right? New characteristics, if that new characteristic allows this dog to survive in a new environment that this dog or canine, right, this wolf never had, well, that is a new trait, all right? That is actually an adaptation, right? That's an adaptation to an environment based on genetic reshuffling and mutations, which add up to new combinations and new traits that don't exist. In other words, this wolf couldn't just turn on this program and become that other kind of dog, because this particular individual wolf doesn't have all the types of genetic information it would need in the right combinations to ever be able to turn that program on in that way. And so through time, as you move from one generation to another, you end up with new types of programs that aren't, they may be the descendants of programs inside the original wolf ancestor, but they have new combinations and, as I said, new mutations, allowing them to express new things that were not possible to express in the ancestor. All right, so oh yeah. So look, the very next slide, he says adaptation and genetic variation can make all these different breeds of dogs, which look all quite different from one another because they're each local, they're each adaptations in their environments. But of course, these changes can't be due to random mutations, right? You can't actually add new information at all. They're the result of programmed responses to environmental changes and genetic variation. I'm not really sure how he fits the genetic variation in there. This is the ICR part here. And I guess they're going to say acting on genetic variation, but actually that's going to be natural selection because that's selecting which variants work best in which environment. And again, ICR doesn't want to say that natural selection or the environment is a force that is able to select a particular group of features within an environment. They say the organisms themselves select and change themselves in those environments. So it's a very weird understanding of adaptation. All right, then going on, he then kind of goes through this sequence in which he shows that you can selectively breed. All right, and so again, now he's starting to mix in natural selection, except he's going to talk about artificial selection, and he's clearly showing that you can select characteristics, right? Because you can take characteristics of one dog and another, mix them with each other, and get a different version of a dog breed that is exhibiting a different set of programming, right? In using his language, now you have a different set or combination of programming that is, in this case, adapted to living in someone's home that likes golden doodles rather than, in other words, they don't want shedding, but they want the nice features of the golden retriever. So the result is of all this genetic variation and all this programming that's going on, right? And what he is calling adaptation. You know, he views each one of these domesticated dogs as adapting to their environment rather than human beings and others selecting and causing these changes. Now, I'm sure he doesn't really believe that, but that's kind of the language he's using, and the result is, hey, we've got all this different variation. And he's trying to make a big deal about how look how really different these different domesticated dogs are, and this was all just the product of internal codes that already existed in the original dog, but now they're being expressed in these different ways because they've been turned on in different ways in different environments. Now, I think this reminded me of Ken Ham, a Ken Ham tweet from back in 2018. He said, the wolf and the coyote are different species. All right, so wolves and coyotes. And evolutionists claim this took thousands of years. Actually, I think evolutionary biologists would say this took hundreds of thousands of years, probably, just to create the differences between wolves and coyotes. But granted, his point is it took a long time. Yet the differences between the Great Dane and the Yorkshire Terrier are much greater, but they are the same species, and we know they were bred, in the last few hundred years. Therefore, evolution is bankrupt. I think Dan Biddle will probably very much agree with this, and after all, he's basically been reading this material, and that's how he came to form his opinions. Um, and I just want to point out that these are two very different things. And I actually talk about this in my paper, Descent with Modification, how post-creationism's claim of hyper-rapid speciation opposes, yet embraces, evolutionary theory. And you'll see that that's me, along with my co-authors, David McMillan and Thomas Beatman. We address these topics, and you'll see that Dan Biddle actually uses one of our figures in his presentation in just a moment. And I want to show you how he misuses or misunderstands it. But back to the dogs. Great Danes and Yorkshire Terriers. Yes, it's true they look quite different. Great Dane, Yorkshire Terrier, right? You think, boy, they look really different. Dan Biddle's saying they look different because they have different programming turned on, but essentially inside they're really the same. They're just expressing different programs in different dogs because the environment has told them you need to do this or this. And I don't actually disagree that they're that different from a programming standpoint of view, right? From their genome, Yorkshire Terriers and Great Danes are essentially the same. There's just a few developmental genes that are switched on and off that make the differences between them. So I would, and there's a reason why these are lumped together. They are the same species. In fact, they're actually just wolves. Most taxonomists would put the Great Danes, Yorkshire Terriers, and all the other domesticated dogs as just varieties of wolves. They're just the same species as wolves. And nonetheless, wolves themselves have a lot more variation in the wild than any of these animals do. I mean, the Great Dane and a Yorkshire Terrier look very different, but a wolf from North America and a wolf from Eurasia are more different genetically, and I'll put it this way, their programming is more different from each other in the same species than a Great Dane and a Yorkshire Terrier. Um, Ken Ham reads a book by its cover. He just looks at the outside appearance and says, oh, look how different they are. And yet they're only like a couple thousand years old. And then look at the wolf and the coyote. They kind of look like each other, so therefore they must be the same. But if you look at their internal programming, which according to Dan Biddle and really a lot of Ken Ham's own scientists within his ranks, they're saying the internal programming, like the genome, the thing that makes it, gives it the characteristics that it has, is really a better way of understanding how much variation they have. And coyotes and wolves are far more different from one another, way more different from one another genetically than a Great Dane and a Yorkshire Terrier, which genetically are cousins to each other. And it very much reflects the fact that they have a very young history. They're only 1,000 years apart, probably only a couple hundred years apart in terms of having a common ancestor, whereas a wolf and a coyote have a common ancestor way much farther back than that. Okay, so here's what really caught my interest with Dan Biddle's presentation. He includes this figure with, I'll note, without giving any attribution to where he got this figure from. And he actually has some minor modification on it because he took out the center of it, it appears to me, because I don't remember making a version that is lacking the center. But this particular figure is from my paper, published just a couple years ago. And in that paper, we were talking about all the different carnivores, and we were talking about how young Earth creationists view different carnivore kinds. And that's what this circle is. And Dan Biddle, what he does is he says, and look, we've been talking about domesticated dogs. So let's say here's a wolf. And you take this wolf, and then we have all these other domesticated dogs. There's like little branches off of here, hundreds of different domesticated dogs. They're all really similar to one another, to make the point I just made. And then you have wolves and coyotes and dingoes and foxes and so forth. And they're more different from each other. But then he's saying, of course, these are all just the dog kind, right? They're all just variations on a theme. And all of those were formed just by genetic variation and programs being turned off and on that were already in the dog kind when you began. Now, if we go to my paper, I had two figures in there. The second figure, which he should have seen as well, includes an image of the conception of what the fossil of the most recent common ancestor of all dogs look like. And if you go back in the fossil record, you'll also find animals that are ancestors of other kinds. So creationists would say, like, you got a kind here, a cat kind, right? They always say, like, dogs can't become cats, right? Or bears, right? They're a kind. And each one of these kinds was represented on the ark by just two individuals. So there were two individuals on the ark, and they became all these different kinds. And of course, that's what they're trying to explain now. That's all the reason for this video, is to try to demonstrate how all this variation could have been packed into just this dog. But let's take a look at what the point in my paper was, which is, this was the illustration, one of the primary illustrations from my paper. I was saying, look, this is what creationists really are saying. They're saying that, of course, cats and dogs don't have a common ancestor, right? They're saying that God created cat kinds, dog kind, he created a bear kind, he created a red panda kind, a mongoose kind, and so forth, right? So there's no common ancestry. But look at the ancestors that young Earth creationists believe that each one of these kinds had. And Answers in Genesis has representations of several of these on the Ark encounter down there in Kentucky. And if you look at their representations, they use what modern paleontologists have kind of come up with as the probable common ancestor, or for Answers in Genesis, it would be the Ark kind, right? The kind of animal that was on the Ark that contained all of the genetic information, the programming to make all the other different species that would evolve after they left the ark. What do you notice about each one of these different mock-ups? Don't you notice how similar they are to each other? If I were, let's say you didn't have, let's say you went back for the creationist, if you went back 4,200 years, so 150 years after the flood, right? 150 years after the flood, and let's put a circle around this. And let's say that you were walking around and you were looking at the different kinds of animals. And at that point, these are all the animals that were there, right? These are all the different kinds. And if you look at them, you're like, hey, they're all 4-footed. They have long tails. They have the same kind of snout, right? Maybe the cats don't even have retractable claws. They got claws that just look like the claws, sort of similar to claws on the dog kind and so forth. If you didn't know that this animal was going to become all these very different kinds of cats, right? Lions versus house cats. If you didn't know that that's what it was going to become and see that amount of variation, and you were to compare a cat with a dog, you'd say, oh, they're so similar to each other. In fact, using Ken Ham's logic on my previous slide, those two animals right there, that ancestral cat and the ancestral dog, they look so similar to each other. They're like two breeds, right, of the same kind of thing. There's no reason why you would believe that cats and dogs were actually a different kind. You would just think they're different variations of the same kind. So in our paper, we propose that there isn't any reason why Dan Biddle shouldn't just say that there was an original carnivore. Oh, I can't write that out. There's an original carnivore right here. And that was the carnivore that was on the ark. After it got off the ark, it had some offspring. Those offspring had variations or had different programs because they went to different environments. In those environments, if we want to go with answers with Creation Institute for Creation Research, hey, they responded to their environments with programs that they had in that original ancestor that turned it into like, hey, retractable claws, right? That's a program. That program didn't get turned in dogs, right? And then those dogs had variation, which then got unscrambled and it turned into a bunch of varieties of dogs. But all of these are just what? Varieties of carnivores. And that's just one kind. And again, Dan Biddle's like totally fine with these really different dogs and these really different cats being the same kind. But I think he would still object to the ancestor of a cat and ancestor of dog, which look more similar to each other than two cats do, as being different kinds. He object to them being, I'm sorry, the same kind. He would think they're still different kinds. Although I don't think anyone living at that time would actually think that. All right, if they had the same thoughts that creation scientists have today, and they lived back then and saw these animals, they'd be insisting that they're the same kind, right? They'd be like, "What are you talking about? These are all the same kind. God made one kind of carnivore." And it's got lots of interesting variations, but those are just variations on a theme of the original carnivore. Honestly, I think there'll be creationists that at some point in the future will probably push back kinds all the way to just a primary carnivore. And we'll just say that all the different carnivores evolved. Because once you've said that domesticated dogs could all evolve from a common ancestor, it's not that much harder to go farther back. All right, I've really been talking too long, and so let's push forward with just a couple other examples. All right, so he kind of doubles down on some problematic definitions. Adaptation, he really is defining here now as programmed responses to changes in the environment. And again, when I said this is an adaptation, white turning to brown, that's an individual that adapts to its environment, but it's all based on its programming, based on its genetic profile, the way it is. That's not an organism adapting over time, over many generations. Or when we talk about adaptations, we're talking about over generations, does an organism become more fit for its particular environment? Not each individual. Individuals really don't actually change their genomes, right? That fox can't change which genes it has that its parents gave to it. It's acting out the genes that it has. And fortunately, one of the genes that it has enables it to sense its environment and change its coat color, just like I can change my skin color slightly from one season to another. But I can only do that because of the genes that I have, and I'm not changing my genes. My genes don't change through my lifetime, and I'll give those genes to the next generation unless I have a mutation, right? Um, and so then he's got this category of genetic variation. Okay, so you can recombine existing genetic information, which I guess is the programs, which then allows different programs to be turned on and off in future organisms. So this is where things get mixed, like basically mixing programs. And now organisms can like do things, maybe respond in different ways. So there's some aspect of like, okay, now you're getting the idea of over generations you can change. And then we get to the crazy stuff, right? And I am running out of time, so I'm not going to have a lot of time to talk about natural selection. But here's this definition of natural selection: extinction of creatures that are unable to adapt or relocate. What is natural selection? Um, I'm giving a 0 to any student on any one of my exams that uses this as their definition. I have a definition that they need to memorize, um, and it's nothing like this definition. Okay. um, Extinction of creatures that are unable to adapt or relocate. Let me see. I think he's got another a couple notes here. Um, it, the ability or inability of a creature to quickly adapt, or move to a different environment often determines whether it lives or dies. There is a sense in natural selection of death, but it's really just outperform or underperform. I mean, the ultimate underperformance is dying completely. But it, the inability of a creature to quickly adapt or move, again, he's stuck on individuals changing. And that's everything I try to beat out of my students, is this idea that individuals are adapting and individuals are evolving over time, that individuals change. No, individuals are who individuals are. They have the genes, they have the genetic makeup, they have the programs they're given, all right, from birth. They're acting out, right, those programs, but the programs themselves aren't changing, right? They allow an individual, like I said, I can adapt to my environment because of the programs I have, but I'm not actually adapting, right, over the long run to anything new. Um, and so he's saying if they don't quickly adapt, if that individual doesn't adapt, then they're going to die, or they have to move. In other words, so if a dog is living in a hot environment but it has a shaggy coat, then it better run, to the north and find a cool location where it can survive. And if it survives there, then it will pass on its genes in that particular population. Now, that's kind of true that organisms do have some kind of option, although this is only really for animals. I mean, plants can't just jump up and run away, right? If the environment changes. What happens to plants in a population? Some will have variations that allow them to survive better in cold temperatures. If the temperature gets cold, those individuals survive better. They have more offspring and maybe give their genetics for surviving the cold to the next generation. But there's other individuals in that same population that maybe have a different set of genes because of that genetic variation, and they don't survive as well in the cold. They don't then therefore produce as many seeds. Therefore, those particular variations aren't represented in the next population at a very high frequency, or there aren't a lot of them anymore. And so what you'll see over time is the entire population becomes better adapted to the cold. Do the individuals adapt to the cold? No. The individuals were either born with the ability to live in the cold because of their genes, or they were unable to live in the cold or as well in the cold. And as a result, their offspring were affected, right? So it's not about the individuals themselves, it's about the collective population, and then which individuals will make it to the next generation, which will then influence the next generation. And in that sense, we'd say the population has changed. The population has adapted to that location. The population has evolved because now the organisms living in that environment have a different suite of characteristics that the previous generation had maybe many fewer of. And then when you combine that with recombination and mutations that individuals may have that allow the next generation to survive better. All right. So, right, natural selection, he keeps talking over and over again about what is natural selection. You either have to leave your environment, you have to really quickly adapt, and I think he really means that this dog with a long coat has to adapt. It means it has to lose its hair. Or like maybe the program has to be turned off for making hair and they'll suddenly lose their hair. And I think that's the way he's actually viewing it, is that they have the option, right? They've got all this genetic information. They have the ability to either not make hair or make hair. So they've started making hair, and if then it gets really hot, they either have to stop making the hair or they have to move to a place where they can use the hair, or they're going to die. Now, why they don't just, if all that's programmed into them, why don't they just use the program and turn off making hair? That's the question. That's what I'm saying is their programming is you make hair, and it doesn't matter what the temperature is, you're stuck with the genes you have, right? The leopard can't change its spots type of thing, right? So eventually, natural selection means extinction of creatures that are unable to adapt or relocate. I think in a super fuzzy way, there is some truth to that, but it's not a very accurate way at all of describing what natural selection is, how it happens. All right, and the last point is he then finally gets to mutations, right? He's been saying, hey, mutations can't really affect all this. And so now he has to kind of like throw in this thing about like, well, of course, evolutionary biologists talk about mutations all the time because they talk about that as the raw resource of variation. Where do variations come from? They come from mutations that change alleles, creating new combinations of alleles and just new alleles. And he's been saying, no, actually, the variation was there from the beginning, right? So God created all the variation. It's just being resorted, and programs are being sort of remixed. Although I don't understand how I could not believe that when you remix programs, that maybe you'll get a new program, a new combination that didn't exist in the original. But let's not go there. Let's go to the mutations. So then he's got this little chart here. What kind of mutations are there? Well, you've got most mutations are said to be random. So their mutations are occurring in a genome. They're accidents of replication and a variety of other different types, but that's the major type. And of course, some of them can be detrimental, right? They can damage a gene, and that might cause a disease. And if there's a disease that causes that organism maybe to not have offspring, if you don't have offspring, you don't have representatives in the next generation. Well, you can't say that you've evolved or changed, right? Because you don't exist anymore. That would be like the worst case scenario. And then a lot of mutations are neutral. They don't really have much of an effect. But what's what the word neutral means, right? So they don't make any changes. And if you don't change anything, well, there's no evolution. All right, that's an oversimplification of the neutrality thing and what's called near neutral mutations, but I don't have time for that. Let's go over here to beneficial. So he says, now what would be a beneficial mutation is it would add information, and as a result of adding more information, it might produce more offspring that survive. In other words, it gives the organism a characteristic that benefits that organism in that new environment, and therefore it might survive. And if it survives, it's going to give more of that new beneficial mutation to its offspring. And then over time, the population will have new characteristics over time. Well, that actually is the definition of adaptation in the evolutionary biology sense. The organism is adapting. The species, I shouldn't say organism, the species, right? The population of all individuals is collectively through generations adapting in the environment and changing and becoming different through this process of adding new genetic variants over time. Now he has this listed, but of course the first thing he says is you can't possibly add information. It's impossible for this to happen. And therefore, if it's impossible to add information to an organism, in other words, you can't add a program, right? All the programming already exists. If you can't add a program, then there must by default be no beneficial mutations. It can't happen. And so you just sort of define it away, right? It can't happen. And so he ends up near the end talking about, well, information only comes, and besides, this stuff we've been talking about is information, right? The genome is information. And information only comes from intelligence. And so he uses this quote, there is no known law of nature, nor no known process, and no known sequence of events that can cause information to originate by itself in matter, right? Or in the physical world. And the quote is from In the Beginning Was Information by Werner Gitt, which is a book from 2006. Now, he just says this as a matter of fact. And of course, he's just quoting another author that he respects, which is just another creation scientist who has said this. And because he's written a book, must know what he's talking about. I just did a 1.5 hour talk. Can new information be gained by an organism? in which I step through very carefully through a molecular biology example showing the origination of new information in a fungus, allowing it to have a new characteristic, which allows it to adapt to its particular environment. It gains the ability to extract iron from its environment because it has several new genes that that particular species did not have before. That is by definition new information to that particular species, to that particular kind of fungus, giving it a new characteristic. It is an adaptation to its environment, allowing it to be more fit in its environment. And the tests actually show that it is more fit. It enables that fungus to live in that particular environment very, very well. And that was just one example of thousands of examples from molecular biology of how information uh, it can be expanded upon, mutations, change programs, and as a result, you get new combinations of genes and programs, and even brand new genes with new functions have been shown to occur. And so therefore, yes, new information can be gained over time. And so if we go back, this category certainly exists in species, and that allows species to adapt and change to their environments. Yes, species have programs, they already have genetic variation. Every species has genetic variation. Some have more, some have less. And they are recombining that information, and that allows them to explore new combinations of genetic information or programs, if you want to go with what he's talking about here, allowing them to then explore variations that might allow them to adapt to different environments as they move around in different places in the world. Um, but ultimately, um, true adaptation requires the addition of even more skills, all right, for an organism. And those skills come from more than just recombining a genome, but it comes from actually the addition of genetic information, allowing that exploration of the physical space around them, allowing them to gain new traits over time. And if I go back really quickly to this particular chart, and we say, if creationists, well, I would say even if creationists want to say that a single canine had all the information it needed to make all the different canines here, that's not actually going to be true. There's really isn't enough genetic information that can be contained in two individuals to be explored into and changed into all the different traits that all the different kinds of canines have today. And if you look at their genomes very carefully, what you'll see is that they have gained new characteristics over time. And even domesticated dogs have multiple mutations that canines or wolves don't have. But those are brand new mutations that have occurred in them and have given them new traits. You know, things like floppy ears, right? You know, that's a trait. That's a trait that you and I like in dog. A lot of people like in dogs. Those new traits are the result of mutations that change alleles, that change the way that their phenotypes are expressed. That's their appearance, which can have an effect on their survival over time. All right, I think that that's enough. I'll say, you know, this talk is full of what sound I think to somebody who doesn't know the scientific principles very well and really understands population genetics and genetics in general. And that's a very small part of, honestly, that's a very small part of the human population that actually understands genetics. I would say that I just got done teaching genetics, and I'm not sure that half my class understands genetics, right? And I'm sure that half my class couldn't describe or really be able to give you a cogent explanation, a definition of natural selection or adaptation. I mean, they haven't taken evolutionary biology yet, but they have had the basics of that in their introductory core classes of biology. And so nonetheless, those are college students who are biologists, and they are going to have some difficulty sort of wrapping their head around the intricacies of genomes and genetics and heredity and genetic variation and how crossing over and recombination occurs, all the mathematical models involved and so forth. All right, so it's not surprising that um, creation scientists, very few of which come from a molecular biology, genetics background, have a very good grasp on these things. And they all end up relying on just a few, what in their mind are experts, who have told them, yes, this is the way to understand this. And so those very few experts, which they themselves mostly don't have expertise, but are better sounding than the rest of them, right? And seem to have the authority and the respect of the rest of the creation science audience, then have a enormously outsized influence, creating these kind of misconceptions. And since they all borrow from one another, it's like a web that just continues to reinforce itself. Oh, I'm saying that. Well, yeah, all those different people agree with me. But where did all those people get those ideas? From just a few individuals who sadly are, incorrect in their statements and not precise in their language. And honestly, I don't think they really care to be precise about it because that would muddy the water. It's easier just to keep these simple misconceptions going because that serves the purpose. And these YouTube videos just end up proliferating these kind of problems. Now, you might be listening to this and you're probably thinking, after all that, and you tried to describe adaptation and natural selection, and I'm still confused. And you very well may be, because I recognize I probably didn't explain it very clearly. It's something that you really need to spend a lot of time on, and spend some time, find some videos that really go through in a very thorough way. And the best way to do it is actually to look at actual scientific experiments, because all these ideas have been tested. They've been tested in the lab and they've been tested in natural environments. We have collected data to try to understand the intricacies of adaptation, natural selection, mutations. Mutations have been measured, observed, created in labs so we can follow their patterns and what they do. It's all enormously complex stuff, but there's a lot of good information out there. Yeah, I'm going to call it quits for now. Thanks a lot. Thanks for listening. I'll talk to you next time. Bye bye.